Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ansible Automates. My name is Ajay Chinampara. I'm a senior solution architect with Red Hat. And in today's presentation, we're going to learn about Ansible security automation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And start the presentation. In this session, we are going to take a quick look at the current state of security, IT enterprise security, and how various security operations centers that are at various stages of maturity, right, are handling incidents and threats through the use of use cases and user personas. We will learn how Ansible can help automate the security operations and, in general, make day two operations for security engineers a lot less painful than it is today. Today, if you look at the state of enterprise IT security, the global spend is around $103 billion for a given enterprise, which usually results in about 40 odd security tools for an average size enterprise. So you would think that, with this amount of investment and so many tools, security teams are handling a lot of incidents and being able to resolve them. But reality shows that only about 5% of alerts are actually being processed by the security teams. And in fact, the time to resolve security incidents have increased according to a greater number of respondents that were surveyed. Now, with the sophistication of these attacks increasing and the complexity of these attacks increasing, when the question is posed to CISOs and C-levels as to how this particular problem can be mitigated, the usual answer tends to be throw bodies. Right. So, by throwing humans at a problem to try and solve a particular sophisticated and something that's scaling using AI and machine language can be quite challenging. In fact, this is not the first time we are learning to fight machines with machines. In World War II, the Germans had a machine called the Enigma, right? So the Enigma was used to encode their messages. And when the British forces, even if they captured these messages, and if they had an army of mathematicians trying to decipher it, and if they deciphered it, the validity of that message was very transient. The reason was Enigma was a machine, right? And machines can generate new cipher suits almost whenever required. And to keep up with that, Alan Turing had the intuition of building a counter machine, right? So the picture you're seeing here is the bomb, which was pretty much used to counteract the Enigma machine. And this was ultimately successful. So in our story, right, our machine is Ansible automation platform. Right. Ansible has a proven track record of automating infrastructure, networks, and applications already. Right. So using that, the strengths of Ansible, right? Its simplicity, its flexibility, its extensibility, using those tenets to expand Ansible's footprint into the security use case is what Ansible security automation is trying to achieve. When you think about, again, like we said in the earlier slide, right, there are an average of about 40 tools being used in any given enterprise for security operations. Now, each of those tools might be owned by different teams. And when an incident happens, it is extremely important that all these tools and teams are able to work together to quickly identify and resolve the issue. And therein lies the challenge, especially because of the lack of integration between all these various tools and teams and potential bureaucracies, ticketing systems, processes that might not lend to quick resolution, what ends up happening is, because a threat has existed in the system for a longer period of time, it can do some serious damage to organizations. And that is what Ansible Security Automation is trying to help engineers resolve, right? The endpoint automation, the last leg of the tools that we work with, being able to have a seamless framework across all these different teams that they can leverage and use as a lingua franca for kind of having a unified language to speak to all these different tools and systems. And the approach that Ansible Security Automation has taken to address this particular use case is to address it through 4 specific pillars, right? So the tools fall into these 4 specific pillars of categories, right? So we have the SIEM tools, which are pretty much correlation engines, right? So log correlation, event correlation engines like Splunk and IBM. We have enterprise firewalls, which are used for ensuring policies are implemented at the edge or inside DMZs. We have intrusion detection and prevention systems that alert security teams if intrusion has been detected, or potentially actively mitigate that incident. And finally, privileged access management, which could be through user accounts, right? So making sure that somebody's not misusing a password, or a particular user's password is not being hacked, right? So these are the 4 broad categories that Ansible Security Automation is trying to address. And we have partnerships with security vendors in order to produce certified content in the form of Ansible collections, roles, and modules, which ultimately become the same way you're familiar with using anything in Ansible. Okay, so what exactly is a security operations center, right? So simply put, a successful security operations center consists of the right technology, the right processes, and very importantly, highly skilled people, right? Highly skilled humans to bring this all together, right? So a security operations center is tasked to ensure that they're going to be responsible to make sure that the business is secure, right? So unlike other ops centers, right, whether it is network operations or data center operations and IT operations, where the goal of those operation centers are typically to ensure that the business is up and available for the customers, the main objective for a security operations center and for that team is going to be to make sure that the business is secure, right? And they do that by ensuring that threats are prevented, right? Compliance measures are in place. There's detection systems and how to respond to threats. So why do we need a SOC, right? For exactly those same reasons, right? So you need these specialized, highly skilled people who know how to implement and manage the life cycle of security tools. They know how to do vulnerability assessment. They know how to do compliance, right? They know how to react and maintain, even interact with other parts of the organization, like, the PR team, for instance, to make sure that a unified communication is going internally and externally to the organization. Now, when you look at the types of security operations centers, right, it's mainly evolving, and it also depends on how big or small an organization might be, right? So for large organizations, a common structure, a common SOC type that's seen is the command type, right? So in the command type, you have a central SOC that is responsible for laying out policies, for assessing the impact of threats, and for making sure that everything is in compliance. And they do not directly influence the endpoints, or they do not go and directly configure the endpoints. They pass out recommendations to other teams saying that this is what the expectation is for this particular compliance requirement or something like that. And then they do audits and ensure that those requirements are being enforced. Now that's a popular model for large organizations. For smaller organizations, simply because of the skills, right, complementary skills between SOC engineers and sometimes network engineers, right, because sometimes you're dealing with almost similar elements like firewalls and load balancers and routers and switches. You might see multi-function SOCs where teams might have complementary skill sets, but again, their objectives are going to be different, as discussed earlier. Finally, the fusion type is a relatively recent and more evolving one that also includes operational technologies, incident response teams, and a lot more data gathering opportunities. So no matter what type of SOC a particular organization has, it makes it interesting and it makes it important to use a framework to classify what type or where in complexity and maturity that particular model is, right? So in this particular slide is providing a framework which on the left side is a more simplistic way of organizing a SOC, and on the right hand side is a mature complex security operations center, right? So let's just go through this one by one to kind of wrap our heads around it. So an opportunistic SOC might be the one, it may not even have a SOC like as defined, right? There might not be a defined SOC team, but an opportunistic SOC is one that is usually reactive, right? So they see an incident and they react to the incident, right? This might simply consist a team of network engineers who are also security aware. Now, as organizations start maturing in this particular framework, they move into the systematic bucket, right? So this is where teams might have event correlation, right? So a SIEM tool like IBM's QRadar might come into play. So organizations that have systematic SOCs have a library of knowledge, right? So they've seen these patterns before, and they know how to resolve those patterns, right? And as you go further to the right, as organizations build more and more maturity, and this might be only applicable to significantly large organizations, taking that institutionalized knowledge from systematic SOCs to build processes around it, right? And to be able to use those processes and orchestrate a solution through, source tools, right? Which is pretty much security orchestration, and response kind of tools like IBM's Resilient is where you might see some of those more complex SOC teams. So, but no matter where you are in this journey, right, and automation and security is a journey, right? So no matter where you are in this journey, Ansible is flexible enough to help you make your life easy in each of these stages. And we will see this as we go through the rest of the slides with some more use cases and understanding some of the personas that might be involved. All right, so let's look at some of the use cases, right? So as we discussed in the beginning, right, what are the main objectives of the SOC, right? Main objectives of a SOC are, when an incident happens, make sure they have triaging capabilities, right? Make sure the team is able to implement preventative measures to even avoid any security breaches. And finally, when an incident happens, effectively respond to that incident. So using these three buckets of use case categories, let's understand how Ansible can help with some specific use cases and some playbooks and examples. Okay, so who are the people involved in this particular scenario and use case that we're going to look at, right? So we're going to have the security analysts, right, who are responsible for SIEM and SOAR tools, maybe, right? They're responsible again to investigate, prevent, and respond to incidents, right? That's their objective. Supporting them are probably going to be network operations teams and IT operations teams, right? Network operations teams are very likely to be responsible for endpoints like routers and switches and firewalls and load balancers and VPNs and so on and so forth. And IT operations teams are going to be responsible for server administration, DNS, LDAP, any kind of single sign-on, things like that. Okay, so what is the tool set they're going to work with, right? Again, this is an opinionated set of tool set that Ansible currently has modules for, and this tool set, this set of modules and automation artifacts from Ansible are growing day by day. So let's just understand the tool set in this particular use case. So we have IBM QRadar, which is going to be a SIEM tool, right? A SIEM tool is a log aggregator and log correlation tool. So that's going to be able to collect logs from various sources. This may be IPS, IDS, firewalls, or even application and server logs, right? And using those logs, filter out and identify, what might be false positives, what are very likely to be security incidents, and so on, right? Redmine is a issue tracking software, right? So typically, when an incident happens, you have to log an issue somewhere. So the toolkit here is Redmine. Cisco and Fortinet firewalls will be used for enforcing endpoint security. And Fortinet IPS and IDS systems are used for detecting security threats, right? And finally, Syncope is a enterprise identity management solution, which can be used for single sign-on, user authentication, and so on, right? So this is the landscape of tools around which the use cases are built for the rest of this this presentation. All right. So the first use case is investigation enrichment, right? So what exactly do we mean by investigation and enrichment? When you look at some of these SIEM tools, right? So for example, if you take a tool like Splunk, the rate at which the vendor charges enterprises is sometimes based on how much data lives on the device or how much logs are being pumped into the particular product. So it might behoove enterprises to have basic logs going to these systems, but during an incident, right? So during an incident, you may want higher information level logs to be sent to these systems, right? So that might be from your firewalls, from your IPS systems, from your IDS systems, from your application logs. So that's one thing. The other thing is, you may have disparate systems at different parts of your environment, and not all be logging into your SIEM tools, right? You might only have, critical components logging into the SIEM tools. But when an incident is detected at the edge somewhere or something that's not considered critical, you might want to enable log forwarding from that particular device into the SIEM, right? So those would be examples of how a security incident, basically the investigation enrichment can be done by additional logging and forwarding logging, right? So let's look at some use cases, and it'll be a little bit more clear. So the first use case, right? So investigation enrichment on firewalls. Let's imagine that the SIEM tools it's been aggregating logs. It detects some incident, and it logs it as an offense. So what does a security analyst do, right? So this is, a day in the life of a security analyst for this particular use case. What does a security analyst do? He or she logs an issue with, a ticketing system. That ticket might travel and reach the network operations person. And the network operations person, depending on the priority and urgency, will have to forward the logs into or change the log settings on the firewalls to make sure that either the logs are being forwarded to QRadar or the log levels are increased while sending it to QRadar. Then what happens, right? And then they shunt the ticket pretty much back to the security analyst, and the security analyst now waits for logs to get collected and makes an assessment whether this is a real incident or something that's a false positive, right? So assuming it's a false positive, what do? Right? So basically, they send the ticket back to the network engineer saying, hey, this was a false positive. You can set the logs back to how it was. Now, again, the engineer has to go inside, log into hundreds of these devices or how many other devices that these log configurations were forwarding to the SIEM and turn off or bring them back to how they used to be before. And then finally, the ticket is closed, right? So think about the different human transactions involved here, right? And think about all the red tape and processes that have to be in place before, from the detection of an offense to the closure of that offense, right? It can be painful, boring, and long, right? So through Ansible security automation, right, using appropriate roles, and like I said, Ansible security automation is going to provide roles, playbooks, modules, collections that address common security use cases, right? So here's an example of a playbook that will allow security engineers to say, okay, all across my Cisco ASAs, right? There might be, let's say, 25 of them. I want all my logs to be forwarded to IBM QRadar now, right? So normally they might be logging into syslog or something like that. Because of a potential incident, you want them to log into the SIEM tool so the security analyst can analyze it. Another example, right? So you might have a Fortinet firewall. A Fortinet firewall, you might want to say, okay, the SIEM has detected the offense or the signature of an offense from these logs. But in order for the analyst to make a more conclusive decision, the logging level of these logs needs to be raised, right? So here's an example of a playbook where you can go and set the logging levels to the desired level that the security analyst can use. Finally, on the QRadar itself, right? In order for QRadar to accept the logs from these endpoints, the security analyst has to go and click on multiple buttons and icons in order to create a valid log source so QRadar can actually accept that log from these endpoints. Again, each of these things, think about it, if you're doing it manually, can be painful and boring and long, right? And it's very possible that you can make some mistakes. But using a playbook that is fairly easy to read and very repeatable, you're able to automate some of these things so the experts can focus on what's important, right? So the security analyst can make sure that the offense is threatening for the enterprise or not, right? And here's another example, right? So instead of the endpoint being firewalls, right? If you need to forward logs from your servers, right? A playbook can be written to simply collect all the log files from all the web servers in the DMZ, for instance, and send it to the SIEM, right? So normally these logs might be sending to a normal syslog logging server, but when a security incident rises, you want to forward these logs to a SIEM tool. Okay, so that was our first use case where Ansible can help with investigation enrichment by allowing security analysts to look at much more detailed logs. Now, in the second scenario, right? So the second scenario is that of threat hunting. So threat hunting is a preventative measure that security analysts do in order to protect their enterprises, right? So this might typically involve things like updating policies that might come down from a security organization, right? So they might have to update signatures, which might be custom signatures, right, on their IPS and IDS systems, or there might be some, general body that publishes that, hey, these, update your products with these signatures to address the latest, virus that's going on or whatever. There might be updates to bogon lists, right, that might classify a new range of public IP addresses to be available, or shut down some existing range of IP addresses, right? So you want to make sure that you filter out those IP address lists, right? So there might be, these are preventative measures that security analysts can do without needing to. It's not a triage situation, right? So this is a preventative measure. So let's look at some use cases here. So in this example, like I said, when a new security bulletin is received, right? So this which might involve internal. This might be internal or external, right? So this might be new signatures, new policies that needs to be implemented. The typical process without Ansible is, you open a ticket, then the security analyst uses his or her tool to click through all the different parts and make sure that the latest signatures are updated, and then close the ticket. Another example, right, where there might not even be a SIEM tool, right? So this might be an example where on an IPS or IDS system, you want to update the signature directly, right? Again, the workflow is once the signature is received, a ticket is opened, work is done, ticket is closed. But the work that's to be done is, again, you log into hundreds of devices and you copy and paste the new signature into these devices, right? There is a better way to do that with Ansible, right? So here's an example of updating a custom signature on an IPS system, right? In this case, a Fortinet IPS system, where a brand new signature is being pushed to the device with a playbook. Okay, so this, when a new signature comes, all you got to do is update this playbook and run the playbook, and it's going to push it out across all the systems in one shot. For a final use case, let's look at incident response. Right, so incident response requires not much of an explanation, right? So this is when how do security teams react, right, when a security incident is reported. So let's look at some use cases to understand this. In the first use case, let's say security analysts have identified a public IP that has infiltrated the organization or is trying to infiltrate the organization, and it needs to be blacklisted, right? So once again, from a process standpoint, the offense is detected by a SIEM tool because of event correlation, right? So it's able to see the IP, the public IP, in logs of various servers, and it looks malicious. So a ticket is opened, and that ticket goes to the security team, has to log into all their edge devices and filter out this IP address or IP address space to make sure that any future request from this particular source IP does not come into their organization, right? And then the security analysts need to wait and make sure that that offense is indeed mitigated, and then close out the ticket. That's the normal process, right? Using Ansible, however, this becomes very, very simple playbook, right? All you got to do is you push an access list to all your edge devices in one shot using a single playbook. A final use case is when there is something like a misuse of credentials, right? So multiple login attempts, for instance, right? Something that triggers, a signature on a SIEM tool, right? Having the SIEM tool detect that, a security analyst is going to open a ticket, and it's going to go to the IDM team, who's going to probably block that account for a while, right? Make sure that those attempts stop, and then request the user to reset the password. And then once the password is reset, finally unblock that particular account, right? So that's normal process. Again, using Ansible playbook, this becomes a simple matter of writing a playbook to go and change the password or go and suspend the user on the given IDM endpoint. Now, what you've seen so far really are snippets of playbooks and snippet of code that are being executed individually, so to speak, right? What Ansible Tower can do is bring this all together in a workflow, right? In an orchestrated workflow where you can have pass and fail criteria. You can test the pass and fail criteria of each of these playbooks and make further actions or further decisions based on that particular reaction, right? So instead of each, the ticket flowing to a different team and that team individual executing a particular playbook to run against all devices, all of this could be orchestrated through API and through workflows to be completely kind of like a closed loop scenario. Okay, so I'm going to bring this talk back, focusing on the maturity model with respect to where you are in your journey, and to reemphasize how Ansible can help at each of these for each of these particular brackets, right? So we have seen that writing simple playbooks to address endpoints might help at that lower end of the complexity, right? So if you're managing firewalls and routers, and instead of still having to go and manually do this, you're able to use Ansible playbooks to make your lives easier. That almost brings you to that middle layer, right, where you now have that body of work through your playbooks. Now, having the body of works to be in a single place like Ansible Tower and integrate with your SIEM tool will make folks who are in that middle systematic part of maturity to improve again their processes and procedures and time to respond. And finally, if you're in an advanced stage of where you are as an organization with respect to your maturity from a security model, you can still take advantage of Ansible through tools like Resilient, right, which has native integration with Ansible that allows you to orchestrate your entire organization's processes by calling the appropriate workflow or calling the appropriate API. Thank you. And with that, we can go over to questions.